Good evening. Good evening. I'm Stuart Firestein. I'm the chairman of the biology department here at Columbia. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to Braintrust, a public conversation about morality and the brain. This is an event that was sponsored and put together by a group called, by the code name NeuWrite, which may be a mystery to some of you. To many of you, this is a group of students, writers of various sorts, scientists, who are particularly interested in the dissemination of science to the general public. NeuWrite as a group actually began at a retreat of the neuroscience department here at Columbia several years ago, when it turned out there were a group of students, a group of graduate students who were particularly interested in this issue of the public dissemination of science. I shared this concern with them. They knew some writing students from the Masters of Fine Arts, the MFA nonfiction writing program here in the School of the Arts, and we decided that we would begin meeting informally to discuss these very issues. How to make science accessible to the public, why this is so important not only to the culture but to the practice of science. I'm happy to say we began these meetings in my apartment, actually, here in the neighborhood, not far off campus. It was a nice informal venue, but we're a very disciplined group as well. And over the years, we met weekly. Now we meet mostly bi-weekly. We write. We workshop these writings. We talk about other writings. We have had many of the foremost science writers and journalists come visit us and talk to us about writing science. And so it's been a real serious exploration of the practice and the problems and the difficulties and the pleasures of writing science for a general public. And I'm happy to say this is now 3 years going on, and there's been no lack of enthusiasm or dedication. I think, as you can see by tonight's crowd and the way this has been put together, this brilliant, I think, program where we have a group of remarkable scholars who cut across the fields of philosophy, neuroscience, and scientific writing, and will present, I believe, a very engaging evening for us. Let me just make some thanks very quickly for the support of this. These are some important people to be recognized, and then we'll go on with it. Of course, most of that support is money, because that's important. The Dana Foundation, the major support for this event actually comes from the Dana Foundation for Brain Research and Education. This was a large grant that they gave us, put together by Megan Fay in our Office of Development. Thank you very much, Megan, for putting us onto that. The Society for Neuroscience has generously donated some money as well. And from here at Columbia, the Office of the Executive Vice President for Research has donated money. The Department of Biology, how'd that happen? I don't know. Also the Department of Neuroscience, and I'd also especially like to thank Fred Loeff from the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, who has supported NeuWrite throughout and who provides the funding for the pizzas that fuel our discussions on a bi-weekly basis. So thanks to Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. Let me now turn the program over to Roger Bingham, our panelist and moderator, who will introduce everybody else and get us started. Roger.
Thank you all. Okay, so would you all please smile? No, I'm serious. Thank you. This is a wonderful gathering, and it's wonderful to have a record of it, although obviously we've got the videos and so on and so forth. But this is an amazing event. So much thanks to NeuWrite for doing this and so on and so forth. Pat Churchland is an old friend of mine and has been inventing this field, essentially. Is this working?
Is it?
This is working?
Okay.
Yeah, okay. In the preface to a book that she did some years ago, 1986, called Neurophilosophy, she said, in the mid-70s, I discovered that my patience with most mainstream philosophy had run out. Later on, she said, it's the nature of the case that boundaries are ill-defined. The book is thus a result of what I... You can't hear me?
Project.
So this is not working?
Sorry.
It is working, but I'm not.
Yeah.
So let's keep the microphone here and I will leave. Would that work? Pat has been an absolute trailblazer in this whole field. of neurophilosophy. And although you can go to the current issue of the Philosopher's Magazine and look at experimental philosophy and so on, and is it time to burn the armchair? Pat burnt the armchair 25 years ago and has been doing amazing work since. Braintrust is her latest book. It's extraordinary. I really encourage you to read it. And there's a review in the Boston Globe today, what neuroscience can and can't tell us about moral life, which is extraordinary. It's a tremendous review of the book, and I'm looking forward enormously to hearing what she has to say about it. And I also want to tell you a couple of things. If you're here, it's being filmed. John Booth is up there, Frank is up there. We're filming this thing. So do be aware that you're on camera, and if you're on the lam from the IRS, or you're here with somebody you shouldn't be with, this will be a good time to leave. All right? After Pat talks, there will be a tape change, just in the business of things, because we have to get a 1-hour tape going. So after Pat talks, there'll be a tape change. Jesse Prince will come up, and then we'll do the 3-panel. How many of you know about the Science Network? Okay. So if you go to www.thesciencenetwork.org, you will find there's a huge amount of material there on morality. We did some meetings some years ago called Beyond Belief 1, 2, 3. And then we went to Arizona recently and did a great debate on can science tell us right from wrong. So we had Sam Harris, Pat Churchland, Peter Singer, Samuel Blackburn, Steven Pinker, and Lawrence Krauss. At the earlier meetings, there was also Richard Dawkins there, various other people. And I think that this whole issue of morality has come back again. So we're going to do Beyond Belief 4 at some point, probably in the beginning of next year. Let me ask you a question that I asked at the beginning of the great debate, Can Science Tell Us Right from Wrong? That's essentially what the topic of Pat's book is, what neuroscience tells us about morality. How many of you at this point think that science can tell you what right from wrong is? Show of hands, how many of you think that science can tell us right from wrong? You want to think about it? Some hands? So in general, you basically don't think this room, at this point, with the exception of 4 hands, do not think that science can tell us right from wrong. Is that correct? Okay. Your job now is to convince them differently. Pat Churchland.
Thanks, Roger. So thank you so much for being here. It's really a great honor and a great pleasure for me to be at Columbia. And it's wonderful for me to have the opportunity to tell you a little bit about the book. What I think I'm supposed to do is to talk very briefly, that is only for about a half an hour, about the main ideas, and then in the course of the conversation between the 3 of us, and I presume there will be questions as well, I think we can kind of amplify and develop some of the basic themes. So the question that really motivates me is where values come from. And we know, for example, that Darwin, and before him Hume, and before Hume Aristotle, said that it is in our nature to be social. And that if it is in our nature to be social, that in some sense, moral practices, conventions, rules, and so on come out of that capacity to be social. Until very recently, I think we didn't know what it meant in scientific, or at least in biological terms, to be social by nature. And hence, in some way, to have a sort of disposition to get along within the group. And I think what has changed a bit, and I wouldn't say that we now really understand the story, but I think what has changed is that in a very deep sense, we can actually begin to understand what it means in neurobiological terms, and hence also connected to molecular biology, what it means to be social. And that really is the platform that I want to talk about. The hypothesis that I'm going to explore argues that, first of all, sociability is a basic value for social mammals. Now, I should explain a little bit about why I'm going to talk about mammals here, but it will become obvious in the course of the conversation. I think that the kind of sociality that you see in termites and bees and ants, for example, has a very different evolutionary history and a very different neurobiological history from the sociality that you see in mammals. It may also be the case that birds are rather like mammals in this regard. But in fact, we don't know as much about the neurobiological basis of sociality in birds as we do in mammals. But I'll have a little bit more to say about that later on. That the hub of sociality in mammals turns out to be this very ancient and rather simple peptide, oxytocin, along with its sibling peptide, vasopressin. Almost certainly there was a common ancestor and they diverged later on. All vertebrates have oxytocin and vasopressin. And it's just that in things like salamanders and newts and frogs, they do a rather different job than what they do in mammals. And so oxytocin and related neurohormones changed the mammalian brain in the course of evolution. Or shall I say that in the course of the evolution of the mammalian brain, oxytocin and vasopressin were put to very different uses. We have oxytocin and vasopressin in our brains, but we still also have it in our bodies, where it does much the same thing as it did in frogs and newts. Another part of the story is that sociability is also deeply connected to the fact that in mammals, there is flexibility in learning, that the mammalian brain is able to learn much more about its physical world and its social world than is, say, a rattlesnake or a scorpion. So the learning of what is proper and how others are and how to interact with others is augmented by the reward system, by pleasure and pain. And finally, of course, with large-brained mammals, we see this extraordinary expansion of the prefrontal structures. Having said that, of course, I also have to make the cautionary remark, which is there's so much about the prefrontal structures that we really don't understand. We know they have something to do with the capacity for self-control, the capacity to defer gratification, to maintain a goal in the face of distraction, to suppress certain kinds of impulses, for example, for aggression that might otherwise cause trouble. How exactly they do that and how the prefrontal cortex interacts with subcortical structures, including such things as the amygdala, the hypothalamus, but also the basal ganglia. How exactly that works is not understood, but it is, of course, a target for important research. So in the development of the mammalian brain, you can, in a very oversimplified way, look at it this way. That Mother Nature sort of said, well, look, if we want to have creatures that have an enhanced capacity to learn, they have to be born with an immature brain, so that that brain can, as it were, tune itself up in the physical and social environment in which it finds itself. However, if the infants are born, as all mammals are, dependent on the parent, you have to rig it so that somehow the parent cares about the offspring, that the parent is devoted to the offspring. And so much of the way we think about, as it were, the maternalization of the mammalian brain has to do with the change in circuitry and the change in the neurochemistry, in particular the neuroendocrinology of the mammalian brain, so that there is attachment and bonding between mother and infant. The infant likes to be with the mother, dislikes, that is, feels pain when there is separation, and similarly for the mother. They want to be together. Now, let me take you to another slide here then. Well, just really basically showing you what the oxytocin molecule looks like. It is a peptide, but it's very simple. It has 9 amino acids. And if you think that means it's complicated, think about, say, hemoglobin, which has more than 500. So relative to other proteins we know about, it is relatively simple. Now, in order to kind of tell the story, the significance of the change in the mammalian brain via this hub, and it's only the hub, of oxytocin and vasopressin, I need to go back and say, but how is it that there are values of any kind? And here I really depend a lot on the early work done by Jaak Panksepp and also Antonio Damasio. Panksepp pointed out that all animals, of course, are organized to see to their own welfare and their own survival. And in the case of reptiles, for example, there is an organization in the brainstem that ensures that those homeostatic variables are kept within the safe range, that it's not too hot, or that if it is too hot, you do something. If it is too cold, you do something. If you're hungry, if you're thirsty, if you don't have enough oxygen, or if you are threatened. Now, the other thing that I think is really interesting is not just that there are circuits that support behaviors to correct changes in those homeostatic variables. It's also that, in a certain sense, that circuitry is intelligent. It sets priorities. So that if you're really hungry, but you're threatened by a predator, then the brainstem rigs it so that you run rather than to, carry on eating. And of course, we have natural selection to thank for ensuring that one's own survival and well-being is taken care of by those structures. Now, part of the point I want to make about this, and I'm not sure this is right, but it seems to me to be a hypothesis worth thinking about, is this, that we often have the idea that emotion is one thing, and it's kind of done by our animal instincts, and reason is this other wonderful thing that, lo and behold, somehow humans alone have this magical capacity. It can't be like that. And when you think about the intelligence of the brainstem that sets priorities insofar as it's sensitive to the environment, there is already a kind of rationality, even in something like an alligator, which can change its course of action depending on what else is going on. So my hypothesis that's sort of intertwined with this idea about sociality is that we should rethink this distinction between emotion and rationality. They're intertwined right from the beginning. So the most fundamental kind of value is one's own survival and well-being. And then what changes remarkably with mammals, it's as though one's own homeostatic ambit expands, so that not only does the mother rat take care of her own temperature, glucose, oxygen, and so forth, but she sees to the temperature, warmth, glucose, and oxygen of the baby. And her signal that something is not right includes not only perception of what else is going on, but the distress calls on the part of the infant. And distress calls really are, apart from perhaps alligators, seem to be unique to birds and mammals. Distress calls cause pain. Getting back together causes the animal to feel good. And so it seems that, and again, this is an oversimplification, but I really just kind of want to get the general idea across, that it's not really that the social emotions somehow came out of nothing, but rather that they are an extension and modification in the good old way that we know evolutionary biology works. They're an extension of what's already in place when I feel pain, if I need oxygen or food or water. So the idea then that I want to move to is that attachment and trust are the platform for moral values in the very deepest sense. And by the platform, I mean only the platform. I think of them as the kind of basic dispositions that shape the social problem space, so that certain kinds of solutions are never really entertained by social animals, that they consider only a certain subset, if you like, of all possible solutions. They constitute the motivation for animals to find solutions to social problems, because, as in the case of the rats, they like to be together. But you might say, well, okay, I mean, that's a story about mothers and infants. We also need, for some animals, a story about fathers and infants. And we also need a story that extends beyond infants to others, and not just to kin. For me, what turned out to be the sort of key to making that step was a discovery about voles. Now, many of you will know the story of the prairie voles and the montane voles, but it's one of my favorite stories of all time. So if you don't know it, I'll go through it fairly quickly, but it's kind of a remarkable story. So voles, as you can see, are little furry rodents, look like fat mice, really. And there are many species of voles, and the two that I'm going to contrast are prairie voles, which you see here. This is probably the dad huddling over the pups and the mom nearby. The prairie voles and the montane voles. They look very similar. Sue Carter, who's pictured up there, was very observant and noticed an interesting thing about prairie voles, and that was after the first mating, they bonded for life. They liked to be together, they liked to stay with each other, they had many, many litters. The male would guard the nest against intruders and fight off other males, other suitors. He would also take a very active role in rearing the pups. He would huddle over them, protect them, provide food for them, and so forth. Montane voles, by contrast, are completely different. They are promiscuous bonders. The male takes no role whatever in guarding the nest or the female or the babies. And the female even does not take as long a time rearing the pups as the prairie voles. If you take a basket of prairie voles and you kind of spread them around the room, after a while they'll kind of come together and they kind of like to just be around each other. If you do that with montane voles, they're loners. They're like those prospectors who come into town once in a while for food, but otherwise prefer to be on their own. So Sue Carter asked this question, and didn't really, I think, expect an answer. What's the difference in the brains between prairie voles and montane voles? And after some false starts and some rather remarkable good luck, they found an answer. And what I'm going to show you on this slide shows the species differences between, and these are showing slices of brain taken this way in prairie voles and montane voles. So these are the montane slices, these are the prairie slices. Now, this says oxytocin receptor, and on the bottom, vasotocin receptor. So let me just sort of, as an aside, tell you something you probably already know, which is it's not enough to have oxytocin sloshing around in your brain. There has to be a receptor for it to attach to. because it's only via attaching to a receptor that it can change the property of the neuron so that the neuron, for example, changes its activity level, either going up or going down. In what they discovered, so oxytocin receptors, vasotocin receptors, they found that in just 2 very specific places in the brain, there was a difference. The density of receptors in part of the reward system known as the nucleus accumbens was much more dense in prairie voles than in montane voles, and it's quite easy to see. And also in another region, also part of the reward system, known as the ventral pallidum. Both montane and prairie voles have lots of oxytocin and vasopressin. Both have receptors hither and yon. But it was these 2 very specific places that showed a difference. So they had, of course, then to test whether this really was significant. They did many, many tests, the most simple of which, first of all, involved taking male prairie voles and female prairie voles, putting in blockers for the receptors for oxytocin and vasopressin, allowing them to mate and seeing what happened. And what happened is they didn't really bond at all. And that was, of course, an interesting clue. They did many other kinds of studies, which I don't have time to go into here, but suffice it to say that it looked like this was not the only difference, because we can't be sure that that's so, but it was a crucial and important difference. And I think this was very surprising to people, because I think many people thought that something like monogamous pair bonding is really a very high-level thing that perhaps humans come to after reasoning it through. It may not be like that. It may not be like that at all. So following this discovery, there was suddenly a huge new interest in oxytocin. Prior to this, everybody knew that oxytocin had to do with lactation and the ejection of milk from the milk ducts. It also played a role, not necessarily a crucial role, but a role in parturition. But now they could see that it had a role in the brain. Part of what it does is that it decreases defensive postures. So when an alien or a strange vole enters the community, initially the animals might be wary, but eventually they calm down. Part of what we think happens is that oxytocin, which is released from the hypothalamus and is diffused quite widely in subcortical structures, downregulates activity in the amygdala, part of whose function is to regulate fear. So levels of fear go down. Also, it has an interaction with the brainstem, and so levels of arousal and alertness and preparedness go down. And then there's a kind of biobehavioral loop between levels of oxytocin and stress hormones. As oxytocin goes up, stress hormones fall, and which makes us even more chummy and friendly, which increases the level of oxytocin, which makes the hormones fall even more. And once then we are comfortable with each other, we can do things like groom each other, take care of each other, and so forth. So the suggestion is that in highly social mammals, we go from me to kin, at least that would mean to offspring. And this also then allows us to expand the care or the concern or the feeling of wanting to be with to affiliates, friends, and others. Now, I think this is an interesting thing because part of what it means is that if you like to be together and do things together, then it opens the door to cooperative behavior, and that's demonstrated so wonderfully in the case of wolves. So here are 2 wolves howling together, which they do prior to a hunt to bring in everybody else. So all of the wolves come in, they jump on each other, they lick each other's faces. The alpha male mounts everybody to make sure everybody realizes that he is indeed the alpha male, and off they go. And what they do in the course of the hunt is not simple, it's very subtle, often very difficult. And it has to be, to some degree, learned. It isn't just a fixed action pattern. So in the next slide, what you'll see, the light is kind of bright, but probably you can sort of see. So what's in the middle here in the stream is a grizzly who has just scored a moose. Really a great thing, right? I mean, this is going to keep him happy for days until the wolves show up. And in this really quite fantastic form of cooperation, they harass and harass, they're persistent. And eventually, as in this case, the grizzly gave up. So various forms of cooperation then can kind of emerge quite naturally without necessarily having to have something like a cooperation gene or set of genes. So clever solutions to problems, be they social or physical problems, can be learned and modified by the offspring, and thus, at least in the human case, and to a very small degree in chimpanzees, we have something like culture. And obviously, culture plays a huge role in what we value and in the values that we live by. Cooperation, of course, involves such things as making boats and manning boats, or in this case, of the Inuit in kayaks, who work together in order to bring in things like seals. Of course, it's also, in the human case, we do these wonderful things like building bridges and so forth. Now, I better move along here quite quickly. Now, so far, this has all been quite positive. I mean, in the sense that we can see how there can be an extension of care, a development of cooperation, given these fundamental values that have to do with extending care to others. But there is, of course, also, at least in humans and chimpanzees, not interestingly, so far as anybody has seen, in bonobos or in marmosets, there is a balance to in-group bonding, which is out-group hostility. And out-group hostility seems, at least in the human case, to be extraordinarily easy to generate. Take random people, put red beanies on their head, take another random set of people, put blue beanies on their head, and give them some task. They hate each other pretty quickly, right? They will compete. And Philip Zimbardo and many other people have explored this in great detail. Now, human history, of course, is a sad reflection of how easy it is to get people to do things like take extraordinary risks with life and limb in order to go to war. But that's another story. I do just want to say that I think aggression is actually going to turn out to be a very complicated part of the story, one which we can certainly address neurobiologically, but I think it's not going to be straightforward, at least partly because it takes many forms, because you see various forms of aggression in reptiles and pre-mammalian animals. In this picture, of course, what you're seeing is probably the swan is defending babies against the dog. The dog should get right out of there. And within species, there is another kind of aggression where there can be sort of competition for females or other kinds of resources, but often, especially in primates, there are very ritualized ways of resolving conflict so that there is not too much damage done within the group. So culture is obviously a tremendously important part of the story, and because I'm really more interested and know more, I guess, really about the neurobiological part of the story, I'm quite happy to kind of let other people address the aspects of culture, of the history of various institutions, how they play into our needs and the respects in which they can become corrupt and so forth. But it's certainly the case that once we've moved beyond small groups and we live in very large groups where we don't know everybody, that the effectiveness of the small group dissipates. I mean, in a small group, you can use moral suasion to change people or to prevent them from doing really dreadful things. In the large group, it often has to happen that we invest trust in an institution, such as the criminal justice system, or a bank, or a method of policing or of controlling such things as having people pay their debts. And perhaps part of that, too, has to do with I mean, there are many respects, I think, in which religion probably plays a role as we move, as our ancestors moved from small groups, where I think by and large they didn't have much in the way of religion at all, at least there's no evidence, where they moved into large groups where maybe religion did play a more interesting role. I don't myself have a clear understanding of the social causes of various religious institutions, but there are many people out there who work very hard on this issue. And finally, I'm just going to end with this slide. I hope that shows up. It's a really lovely slide, but it actually makes a serious point. And it's probably one that will come up in the discussion. And that is that, yes, we humans and all of us big brain primates, and indeed all of us mammals, have our natures. And we think of orangutans, for example, as being essentially loners, and in Borneo they are, given the way they make a living, and they're like bears. They each need a large territory, and they want the other guy out. And so we have thought of them as not really social in the way that, for example, bonobos and chimpanzees and baboons are really intensely social and have ranks and matrilines and so forth. But in this case, the resource situation is very different. So this is in a rescue area in America. I've forgotten exactly where it is. And, pardon me? In Des Moines, you're right. And so here's a guy who I call Rusty, and Rusty was alone for many years, and then along one day comes this old hound dog, and he comes kind of loping into the field, and he looks around, and he kind of checks things out, and he finds Rusty. They bonded. They became inseparable, and as you can see, they do many of the same things together. And this has motivated an idea that I know Paul Seabright and Matt Ridley and Steve Pinker are exploring, which is certain kinds of changes in the ecology, including changes to the institution, can incentivize a change in behavior. They can do things like make certain kinds of conflicts just too stupid and expensive, and so people don't engage in those sorts of conflicts. And this slide I like because it reminds me that, yes, we have a nature, but the nature that we have here and now in New York in 2011 is probably quite different from the nature that our Homo sapien ancestors had roughly 250,000 years ago. I don't mean that our brains at birth were different. There is not the slightest evidence that they were. Probably my brain at birth was indistinguishable from the brain of someone born, a human born 250,000 years ago. But I learned to ride a bike and to read and to engage in exchange. I learned to find certain things disgusting, which I would not have then. I learned to have certain intuitive responses to certain kinds of situations, which I would not have then. And many of these things then are almost certainly tuned up. We think of them as conscience, but they are part of what gets tuned up by this huge plastic brain that we're born with. And I'll leave it at that, and I think now we can maybe have a change of tape and questions and discussion. Thank you so much.
So now we'll have a little conversation. Jesse has just joined us, Jesse Prince, Distinguished Professor of Philosophy in the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. And actually, Pat and Jesse were both at a meeting in Missouri last week, I think it was, discussing some of these issues. We're going to have a brief conversation here, and then I would like to invoke you. But let me ask you a quick question. Did Pat have any effect on you? I mean, do you now think that science, neuroscience, can help you distinguish right from wrong? How many more people?
I just said it didn't.
Sorry?
I think I just said it didn't. I mean, I think the effect of understanding the neuroscience is going to be quite subtle. I mean, I think the subtlety comes in maybe not taking our intuitions quite so seriously, or in thinking that our culture does it this way, the rest are barbarians. And I think it is always important. I mean, you know, as Dan Dennett used to say, you don't want to be so open-minded your brains fall out. But a certain kind of relativism is what we live with. There aren't absolute exceptionless rules. And philosophers who busted their chops nigh on the last 40 years trying to get them have failed. And so it doesn't happen.
Yes, but the question when we asked it last time,
I see, yes.
not to trivialize it, was whether an injection of neuroscience and understanding of how brains work, how minds work,
Right.
could in fact give people a better sense
Yes.
of what the science of morality was about. Just to gloss it a little bit.
Yes.
And in fact,
Yes.
as we went through that debate, the numbers went up. So
Yes.
thank you for undercutting
I
my...
agree, actually. It's just that there is out there, because of Sam Harris's book, the idea that somehow neuroscience is going to tell us when it's okay to kill a non-combatant if they voluntarily act as a human shield. I don't think so. And I don't find one single, I mean, I like Sam in many ways, so this is not a personal thing, but there is not one single example in that book of a neuroscientific fact that bears upon a moral issue.
So when did mammals begin?
Pardon me?
When did mammals begin? 350 million years ago?
Approximately, yeah.
No churches? No churches.
No churches.
So what's the relationship between evolution of what you're talking about, moral values, fairness, justice within species, and this imposition later of religious values?
I think I'm going to turn this over to Jesse. No, I mean, I'd be happy to comment on it, but I think you know, people are going to get tired of hearing the sound of my voice.
Let me kind of give a segue, because there's a question here about the role of religion in morality. With respect to the descriptive question, how do we get the values we have? It's obvious that religion plays a role.
Yeah.
And I think the conversation began, can science tell us something about morality? And I think the obvious answer to that is yes, but an important follow-up is which science or which science is. And one of the things that's really wonderful about Pat's book is there are various opportunities for her to deliver a very reductionist story where it comes down to the brain and just the brain. And she resists that. Even on the question, is morality innate, where the biological mechanisms are so tempting to appeal to, she says no. In response to Mark Hauser, who's argued that morality is a faculty much like language, it's an innate faculty that we're all born with, she says Hauser's wrong about language, and he's certainly wrong about morality. And the other thing that's come out already is she says, look, culture is going to be an important part of the story. But that leads me to think the book needs a sequel. It's as if what we get at the end of the book is an appreciation of the many ways in which culture is informing morality, but not a story about how that connects to the neuroscience. And religion's going to come up. Take the vole. So we have these voles, these atheist voles, godless beasts. And they have different values, we might say, to use that term broadly. Some of them think it's good to form long-lasting pair bonds. Some of them seem to resist that lifestyle. And there's a biological mechanism that sheds some light on it. And if we look across species, we see a lot of variation in how people form kinship relations. In primates, in the great apes, we see the orangutan, who is usually a fairly solitary creature. It's an ape that has kind of brief hookups, and then they kind of part ways, so kind of serial dating animal. You have chimpanzees, and there are two kinds, panpaniscus and pantroglodytes. The pantroglodytes have a female exogamy system where adolescent females leave the group and go to some other group, find a mate, but they don't really pair bond. They also have a lot of different hookups. And then there are bonobos, or panpaniscus. There, the males leave the group, has interesting impact on the power structure, and evidently they have a very good sex life. Apes vary. Gorillas have a harem system, one male, multiple females. And you might think, look, there's going to be a biological story. There's a question we can ask. What sort of ape are we? Are we a polygamous ape, or are we a monogamous ape? And people ask this question. There are studies that measure human male testicle size with the thought that this will deliver the decisive answer.
How does it go, actually? Anyway, never mind.
Well, I think that's an interesting question for the sociology of science, because, of course, the claim that is made, predictably, is that we're more of a monogamous species. That very often comes, I mean, there are different scientific views about this, but the claim that we have tendencies towards pair bonding, towards monogamy, is, of course, a valued claim, and one that's reflected by the fact that the scientific community delivering this claim is coming out of a culture where those are the dominant values. But if you look cross-culturally, and here's where we make the move from the biology to the anthropology to the social history, we see tremendous variation. Human kinship systems are as varied as the logical combinatorics would allow. And if we do it statistically, we can see that at least legal toleration of polygamy is by far the more typical pattern. What's the explanation of that? Is it that we have oxytocin systems that are more like one vole and less like the other? Or is culture allowing for a kind of plasticity that's quite different from what we see in these more biologically determined species? Enter the church. Why are we monogamous? One story about this is a cultural history story that says the introduction of monogamy as a legal and moralistic system for human bonding is a fairly new invention. It was part of Roman law, but not really part of Roman practice. And it certainly wasn't true in ancient Judea for people who've read their Old Testament, nor was it true in Greece or in Egypt, the great civilizations of the ancient world, but it emerges with Christendom. And why? The answer to that question won't be found in our oxytocin levels. It won't be something about the change from lead pipes to some other kind of environmental factor. Don't laugh. I mean, it's possible that various dietary factors could contribute to a difference in social behavior. But it's a place where we can actually shed some light on human variation that goes beyond biology. So I think what we ultimately want to get is a kind of inclusive, multi-level science that allows us to look at maybe how these systems are being affected by enculturation, but the biocultural interaction becomes the locus of real action for doing the science of morals.
Yeah. No, I absolutely agree. And of course, one of the developments within neuroscience has been to see what effects there might be on social behavior, but also on oxytocin levels as a function of the nature of the childhood. So in one study, for example, women who had very abusive upbringings were compared to women who had more typical upbringings. And the social behavior was also studied. And of course, as you might imagine, these people who were abused had more difficulty forming long-term relationships and were less comfortable in many social circumstances than the other group. There was a significant difference in oxytocin levels. Currently, we do not have the capacity to test in live humans anything about oxytocin and vasopressin receptor density. That may change. But normally the way, of course, it's done in the rats is that you inject the rat brain with a dye that will bind to the receptors. Then you sacrifice the animal, slice the brain, and look at the region of interest. So I think in the case of humans, I think almost certainly what we're going to find is there's a lot of variability in attachment and bonding between mates as well as between parents and offspring.
So let me ask you a question here. I mean, there's a number of books that have come out on this subject. This happens to be the one called Moral Markets by Paul Zak, that edited The Critical Role of Values in the Economy. And the kind of chapter titles you get in here are things like the status of moral emotions in consequentialist moral reasoning, fairness and other regarding preferences in non-human primates, evolution of free enterprise values. You know this stuff. You've read this. The vital role of norms in maintaining open and public and private. The way in which this research is being introduced now into public discourse seems to me enormously important that it be done in an appropriate fashion. I mean, how much good evidence is there in here?
Well, look, I mean, I think the thing that one always has to be really careful about is drawing inferences from current behavior to how life must have been in Africa for us in small groups 250,000 years ago. And as I said earlier, nobody has any evidence yet. This isn't to say that there won't be found any, but we have no reason to think that our brains here and now are different from the brains of Homo sapiens with respect to things like cognition and temperament are significantly different. So you have to kind of ask yourself about what kinds of social practices they were likely to have had. And the way anthropologists, of course, go about this is to look at such hunter-gatherer groups as currently exist. And I think that that can actually be very revealing, because we find that there are certain kinds of social practices and conventions, and that they're often reflective of the particular ecological conditions that the group lives in. So, for example, it was not uncommon, at least until recently, for the Inuit, who were always on the edge of starvation, to practice infanticide. You have to have a certain number of hunters who can bring in the game, and if you have too many mouths to feed, people will starve. And in other places, infanticide was not practiced, but we can understand why a practice like that existed, and we don't feel, at least I would not feel comfortable saying they were wrong to practice infanticide. So it's going to be very important not to import notions like fairness into a domain where maybe it doesn't have that much traction. And fairness might be like the idea of universal human rights. It might be fairly recent, or it might have existed in the way that it exists already in say, capuchin monkeys, who don't like it when the neighboring capuchin gets a whole lot of goodies and this guy just gets cucumbers, and he boom, pitches them out at the researcher. So a rudimentary sense of fairness might have existed, but a sort of refined and sophisticated sense of fairness, such as what we currently enjoy, might really be a very recent thing. And as I said, the idea of universal human rights is very recent. So I mean, one of the things that people are wont to do is to say, oh, a certain kind of capacity or behavior is common or universal, so it must be innate. The inference doesn't work. There's lots of things which are universal because they turn out to be good solutions, kind of obvious solutions to ordinary problems. Everybody we know of throughout history, if they've had wood available and they lived close to water, made boats out of wood. Well, what else would you do? Make them out of rocks? I mean, wood is easy to work with. You can use stone tools to dig it out. You can lash logs together and make a raft. So you don't need an innate disposition for making boats out of wood. Likewise for carrying things on your back. You don't need a gene for that. It's just kind of pretty obvious. And it's just a good solution, an obvious solution that anybody with any sense, so to speak, will land on. And so when, for example, Jonathan Haidt argues that certain kinds of behaviors are seen to be very common and infers that they must be innate, I'm very, very leery of that inference. If he could back it up by data from molecular biology, that would be different. If he could back it up by data from neurobiology, that might be a little different. But as it stands, you can't just make up a good story about, well, you know, there you are in Africa, and you know, it'd be really, you know, you'd have a big advantage in terms of natural selection if you made boats out of wood. It isn't a good story.
So, Pat, let me just, I need to ask you both two questions, because these are the most common ones that I come across from people out there. Let me first of all read one of the quotes you put at the front of your book. It's from Ian McEwan's novel, Eternal Love. This is our mammalian conflict, what to give to others and what to keep for yourself. Treading that line, keeping others in check and being kept in check by them is what we call morality. Right, so I'd like to hear what Jesse thinks about that, but I also like to hear from you both about two things. One is the trolleyology, and you can set that up yourself. And the other thing is John Haidt and his 5 moral values. Can I let you just go with that?
Sure, yeah. Well,
because you've got that nailed.
We can, the trolleyology, but maybe we should start with the quote. I mean, so there's this question about distribution as the essence of morality, and I think one thing we need to bear in mind is there's a distinction between moral values and moral behavior, and there's a lot of research on why people engage in pro-social behavior, why they share, for instance, and there are a lot of species that share and do all these pro-social things without making moral judgments. If you really want to understand morality, that is the practice of assessing certain things as good or bad, it's important to also look at our judgments, our intuitions about what's right. And unlike a lot of other species, like insects that will naturally engage and automatically engage in altruistic behavior, you want to find a model for a species like us that engages in this behavior because of the judgments that we make. And there again, culture will matter. So suppose you're a CEO of a company and you have a bit of money at the end of the year to distribute as bonus money for your employees, and you have 3 choices. You could distribute the most money, the highest bonuses, to the people who earn the most for the corporation, the best workers. That's the equity choice. You could distribute equally, giving every one of your employees the same bonus. Or you could distribute as a function of need, giving the most to the people who are in most financial need. So how many of you would give to the best workers, give the most bonus to the best workers? How many of you would give equally to everyone? How many of you would give as a function of need? So variation of opinion, this is a very weird sample because you're all academics, homo academicans is liberal and perverse. But if you do the work, what you find is a North American sample will typically respond equity, give to the best workers. That's the spirit of capitalism. Chinese respondents will say give equally, and Indian respondents will say give as a function of need. So if you say the essence of morality is the question, how should we distribute our resources? You also need to recognize that the moral judgments that direct us in answering that question vary as a function of culture. So.
Yeah. No, I absolutely agree with that, and I think that does sort of pick up on the weakness of the quote. But I think, too, that it's important to realize that many of the social practices that you might say are normative are not learned explicitly as rules. And telling the truth is one example. I mean, we all know, even though we say to our kids, well, you must tell the truth, we all know that you aren't supposed to tell the truth all the time, that there are certain kinds of cases that are clear exceptions where telling the truth would cause much more harm than good. And I think even something like helping other people. What one learns as you grow up is that there are certain prototypical cases of when you're supposed to help, but that then it gets very complicated, and just the way we were talking about earlier, that sometimes help will be perceived as meddlesome. Sometimes it will incur an expectation that you can't actually live up to. Sometimes I don't want that kind of help, and so forth. And it too varies across cultures. And so as I discovered among the Inuit, they have a much higher threshold when it's appropriate to help. They consider that things where I thought I genuinely needed help, they thought that I would be insulted if they helped because it would seem that they were questioning my competence. And so they let me struggle on. So many of these things, I think, are picked up in these very subtle ways through stories and conversations and prototypes, and they're not picked up as absolute exceptionless rules that we're supposed to follow come what may.
Trolleyology?
Trolleyology. How many of you are familiar with trolleyology? A few hands. Jesse will now give you a 101 in trolleyology.
A runaway trolley is speeding down a track. Unfortunately, 5 workers are on that track, and the person running the trolley can't stop it from moving. Those 5 people will die. But fortunately, someone standing along the side of the track has an opportunity to prevent tragedy from striking. By simply pulling a lever, she can divert the trolley onto an alternate track where it will kill 1 person, there's 1 worker there, but those 5 others will be saved. Then there's a poll. Intuitively, given your own moral values, do you think it's permissible to pull that lever? So how many think it's permissible to pull the lever, saving 5 lives where 1 will die? Hard audience. Comparison case. Same trolley, speeding out of control. Still, you have a person on the side of the track, but this time there's no alternate track. Instead, the person along the track is by a footbridge, is able to climb that footbridge where another person is standing who's of sufficient girth to derail a runaway trolley. She wonders, should I push this person into the trolley's path? The trolley will be derailed, 5 people will be saved. How many think it's permissible to push somebody in a trolley's path in order to save 5 others? Show of hands.
Less hands.
So fewer hands. So what we find with these intuitions, and the most careful work has been done on this by John McHale, but very many others have gotten into this game.
Oh, David Pizarro as well.
David Pizarro has done wonderful manipulations where he looks at the ethnicity of the victims and gender issues and class issues. But basically what you find in those starting cases is that about 90% of people think it's permissible to shift the trolley onto an alternate track, killing 1, saving 5, and about 90% of people think it's impermissible to push a person into a trolley's path with the same numerical outcome. And with that division, we've had whole subfields, whole cottage industries in philosophy born. So people have tried to identify the principle of moral value that could dictate this difference, that could say it's permissible in one case and impermissible in the other. And one of the recent things that's happened in the science is people who are studying the psychology of morals have tried to say maybe these philosophical principles are not the ones that we're actually using. If you try and figure out why people made this decision, they don't seem to have at least conscious access to the kinds of principles that philosophers invoke, like a moral difference between killing somebody and merely letting somebody die. But what you do find, and this was first advertised by Josh Green in a neuroimaging study from 2001, is that the phenomenon of pushing somebody into a trolley's path is extremely loaded emotionally. That's a very intense affective response. When you imagine physically contacting a person, if I simply approach you and we measure your galvanic skin response, you're going to see it going off the charts because human contact, even friendly human contact, is aversive, it's unpleasant, it's emotionally charged. Physically killing someone is an incredibly difficult thing to do from an emotional perspective. Pulling a lever is the height of innocuous action. This is why wars have become so dangerous, because we can now kill by button pressing. And I think that what Green first tapped into, and I think he maybe over-described the results, is that a difference we find in moral intuition here may have to do with the kinds of brain mechanisms that are engaged when the scenarios are presented in these two different ways.
Now, those are very theoretical cases. You could place against that the instance of somebody, which we talked about with Don Pfaff recently, of somebody who actually threw himself onto the subway rail to protect somebody from being... So this is a real-life situation where somebody actually threw themselves onto the rail to protect somebody from being killed. All these other ones seem so otherworldly that many people have trouble getting to grips with them. I mean, and Pat, you...
Yeah, and I think they're very... obviously the idea was to pare down the examples so that there was no context, on grounds that if there were a context, it would be a confounding variable. But the problem is that the way our moral skills work is in a context that's rich. And it matters, for example, whether the fat man that's being pushed is actually the president of the country. Then people would say, well, you don't push him. And this turned out, well, some people say. So it turns out that you can easily show that that just by introducing a few contextual matters, you can shift people's responses. And in fact, Jesse mentioned to me the other day in Missouri that if before being presented with the alternatives, the pushing or not pushing case, I just watched some boring movie and he watches Saturday Night Live and then he's asked, will you push? Ah, sure, push him. Right? So even that change in context, so that now you're lighthearted, and it's because the situation has nothing to do with reality. And so I actually worry that we haven't learned anything.
So do you want to answer that?
Just a word. The claim that by controlling variables we can figure out what's making a difference, the claim you started with, is, I think, important not to lose here. It's true that psychology always suffers from the threat of ecological invalidity, which is the technical term for designing experiments that just don't correspond to real-world choice contexts. But the value of being able to control variables individually is very great. And if you take David Pizarro's work, where he looked at how race interacts with it, if you look at John McHale's dissertation, where he showed that women and men have different intuitions about these cases, that's an important discovery. So there's been 20 years of thinking about, are there gender differences in morality? 30 years of this. It's been very hard to find. He found one. And that's a datum we wouldn't have gotten just by casual conversation. The psychology has brought it out. It cries out for explanation. Psychology and neuroscience won't give us the explanations. Social science broadly might.
Yeah, it might. But I mean, I don't even know about the data regarding men and women. I mean, it might be that women are disposed to think a bit longer, like, well, who actually are these guys, right? And why doesn't the guy who goes up to throw the fat man, why doesn't he throw himself off? And how thin is he actually? And I mean, for all we know, because nobody tested for that, we don't know whether
that's
it bears
good science. You do the follow-up
judgment in any interesting way. And as I tried to bring out in the helping case, I think moral judgment's often a really subtle thing that's made in the context where what the brain is doing is a constraint satisfaction process. And all kinds of variables go into it, and the brain eventually settles into a local minimum. And so past memories, past examples of prototypes to which this may or may not be similar, and the respects in which it's different, that all goes into what the decision is. And I hesitate to talk about moral judgment because often philosophers think that you need a language to do it, which I very much doubt. And they think that you need to have it sort of framed in terms of a rule. And sometimes even, I mean, if you're a Kantian, for example, you have to do some really deep things about being free and being a person that, quite honestly, I never have been able to do. So.
So just a quick comment then. I want to start roaming amongst you and getting some comments. As I said, the current issue of the Philosopher's Magazine has several articles about experimental philosophy, including a piece by Josh Knobe. And in Science, on the 18th of March, 2011, a big piece by Sean Nichols on experimental philosophy and the problem of free will. So these things are getting around. I'm interested to know what somebody like Phil Kitcher would think about this, or Pat Kitcher.
I want to applaud Pat for taking her stand on artificial problems in which all the resources we normally bring to thinking about things like, gee, I'm not that fat myself, so I can't jump. And if I try to push the guy, he's probably not going to fall.
Yeah, there's that.
And even if I get him off the bridge,
Yes.
then, you know, he's not necessarily going to land on the track. So,
Yeah.
I mean...
No, absolutely. And
but then I'm a ditherer.
I always thought about the mess.
But I like very much what you said also in response to Bob Klitzman.
Yeah.
It seems to me that there's a lot, that what you've done very clearly is construct a platform. And what I think Bob is interested in, and what I'm interested in, is how the scaffolding gets built on that. So let me tell you what I think is actually crucial to getting the scaffolding to go up. And that is that we get enough care for kith and kin, enough altruism towards them, enough other directedness, if you like, to get together. But as various studies of primate societies show, they tend to be uneasy. They're tense, they break down. And either you stay there, as the chimps do, or you find a way out. And the way out our species found was a kind of working and reasoning together. And I think, contrary to something you just said, that actually did involve language, rather crucially. The ability to work out solutions together demanded some form of communication. And it began very small, and then it evolved in just the way you were sketching, I think, in terms of cultural institutions and cultural evolution, into the ramified collection of moral practices that we have around the world, which have certain commonalities, but also certain differences. And with respect to the differences, I'm inclined to favor, the word I like is pluralism rather than relativism.
That's actually
so
a better
there might
choice.
be certain kinds of things that are core, like a basic commitment to telling the truth, that sort of find their way as common solutions to problems. Not because we have a gene for honesty,
Absolutely.
but because that's a very important feature of solving problems that arise in the human social situation. So you and I think, are on the same page. We both think that morality grows out of the human social situation. But you're interested in sort of explaining how the roots got placed in the first place, and I'm interested in trying to find out how the plant grows after that.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I want to continue kind of working at the neurobiological level to understand in more detail the nature of the circuitry that's involved in sociality. I am unsure about the role of language, because I fully expect that for probably at least 100,000 years, humans didn't have much. But I think they probably, acted in a cooperative way in the hunt, just the way the wolves did. I think there's lots of evidence they were scavengers as well as hunters as well as gatherers. And I think they probably kind of worked things out in much the same way that wolves do. And part of the reason also, I think this, is that having been amongst the Inuit, where they actually don't talk that much. I mean, they're not like a philosophy class where people are talking all the time. And in fact, at a certain point, I was reminded of this because the Inuit that was with a group of students that I took up into the Arctic on a rafting trip sort of took me aside once and said, why do they talk all the time? Why can't they be quiet? And when we finally got to Herschel Island, where the Inuit community was, it was quite interesting. I mean, the people would come and they would sit with us and have tea. But you just have your tea. And you're together, but you don't yap away. So it makes me wonder, That's all. And what I worry about is, with regard to language, is this idea that we do it, and so we import it back to the ancestral condition 250,000 years ago. And I just kind of wonder.
So Pat, there's a few questions up here. Here's the first one.
Hey, Pat, thanks. I thought maybe you were going to be an eliminativist about values and say something about, propositional attitudes and how they didn't mesh with vectors or so forth. But it sounds like you're a realist when it comes to something like moral behavior. So my question is, if you have instances where the moral behavior or any kind of action is the same, but the people themselves claim to have differing values, at that point, do you take, the pragmatist line and say, well, if it's the same behavior, it's actually the same belief? Or do you think there are experimental methods that we could come up with that would somehow allow us to say, oh, it's this value that's in play here, and isolate another value which might, not be relevant to the situation?
Well, yeah, that would, a proper answer would require, I think, a long discussion. But suffice it to say that I think anthropologists, field anthropologists, are really, really good at sorting these things out. If they really pay close attention to what's going on and live amongst the people. But look, I mean, I'm not an eliminativist with regard to such things as consciousness, despite, Rutgers.
Gotcha. What about beliefs? Like, do they come in here, and is there something?
Look,
are there real beliefs?
Yeah, I'm being dragged into this.
Yeah, sorry.
Look, here was the basic idea of eliminative materialism, such as it is. Paul and I made the prediction that just as many early scientific attempts or early common sense attempts to understand physics and biology were revised and changed as science developed, so we made the prediction that this might well happen with regard to the sort of set of concepts that we use to understand each other. Some of them might live quite well into a scientific psychology, and others might not. And there are real problems, as you know, with regard to trying to map the notion of a belief onto particular brain structures. A goal is easier. Something like self-control is easier, even though we think that impulse control has probably different kinds of circuitry for slightly different kinds of problems. So that's an instance of fractionation. We thought that the fractionation of memory into many different systems that are honored by the anatomy and that are dissociable experimentally as well as through nature's experiments was an indication that folk psychology circa 1900 already had begun to change. Exactly how it will change and whether people will continue to talk that way, of course, is a social question to which I have no answer. I'm really kind of interested, as now neuroscientists are, especially those who are using MR, and they're finding, activity here, there, and everywhere for this concept, that concept, and there's a Schadenfreude area. I mean, really? And so Russ Poldrack, for example, is asking the question, how many of these function level constructs actually map onto activity and circuitry from the perspective of the brain? And it's an unanswered question.
Now, someone like William James, who might say, all the different religions, in some way have the same belief because they might have the same practice. Would you agree with that? Or?
No.
No, right.
No, of course not. I mean, a Buddhist doesn't believe in a personal God and doesn't have a set of rules. Of course not.
Right.
No, I mean, James was just wrong about that.
Jesse, you want to say something? Then I happen to find myself standing next Sally Sattel from the American Enterprise Institute, so I want to get a question about that.
You mentioned before the work of John Haidt, and one of the things that John Haidt has done is he's identified these different domains in which moral judgments arise. And with Pat, I think becoming overly nativist about those domains is probably a dead-end street. But the idea that people have moral values that involve distributive justice, that involve rights, that involve harms, that involve purity, that involve hierarchy, and so on, is a clearly demonstrated fact. And that these are underwritten by different emotions, by different kinds of rules, that seems to be well established by the science as well. to that extent, the idea that morality is monolithic is, I think, open to an empirical critique. So at the end of the day, will we end up with moral judgment being a single coherent category? Maybe not. So Pat's style of argument that she's been engaged in for so many years may reemerge in this domain as well. So
one quick question. I'm told that this is actually running late. Do you want to leave at this point, or would you like to stay? You'd like to stay? Okay. This is Sally Sistell. Could you stand up for a second? Because they can't get you on the camera.
I'm an accidental questioner here. You know, you had mentioned, and I'm great sympathy with what Pat said about the role of science in the ability to help distinguish right from wrong. I don't see it. But I also read every word of Sam Harris's book, and I know that we share a sort of puzzlement over, or at least a frustration that he didn't provide any kind of mechanism or example by which science could resolve this. So I guess my question, and maybe I'll ask Jesse, but because I think you and I talked about this a bit already, is what could an answer look like to that kind of question?
I actually think science can do a lot to tell us what's right and wrong. But what we need to remember is the question, what's right and wrong, is always already an internal question. It's a question that we approach from within a set of values. Consider positive psychology. So positive psychology says, look, let's use science to figure out what makes people happy. And once we've helped figure that out, we can give people some normative advice. Like, given that these are things you like, go out and do this. And it turns out that the correlates of happiness, the things that make people happy, vary from culture to culture and from person to person. So the advice will be a script that differs depending on the recipient. I think morality can tell me what I value. Sorry, science can tell me what I value. It can help reveal values I might not know I have. And it can help me figure out how to construct a society that is more conducive to living in accordance with those values.
We have to do this every month. We always do follow-up questions. Well, okay, I believe what Sam said is how neuroscience, that was the original title of his book actually, how neuroscience can help determine human values. And tell me where I might be wrong here, because it seems to me it can't determine values. It can only help you achieve the realization of the values you already have. Could you give me an example how neuroscience
Harris is cheating. He's cheating in the following way.
I think that's right. But
here's the setup. Ask a group, what would you prefer? What would be better? A world of universal suffering or a world of universal bliss? Crowd roars. Universal bliss is better than suffering. That's an expression of preference. That's not a scientific discovery. That's an expression of our desire to flourish. And you can easily imagine a person, a certain kind of sadist, saying, oh, how lovely, a world of writhing bodies. Imagine Milton's Satan answering the question. And I think it's at that moment that we realize that this is a kind of cheat. It's a way of the idea that you can build morality from a purely descriptive starting place is something we've known to be wrong, fundamentally, logically wrong since Hume. It doesn't mean science can't help us live the lives we want to live, but science can't tell us what to want.
Hi, thanks for the nice discussion. So if we're really starting to understand the molecular correlates to our tendencies towards altruism and pair bonding and cooperating in societal norms, at least the beginning of that, then there's definitely not going to be a blank slate that you're born with. There's going to be a great deal of inter-individual differences in genetic programs that mediate levels of the expression of oxytocin receptor, for example, where it's expressed, and that kind of distribution. So, in addition to the environmental factors that you mentioned, so I'm curious on what you both think, how we use that kind of information in making moral assessments of different acts. So does a dramatically different neurochemical architecture in the brain excuse an act?
I see, that's the question. So this kind of brings us to the issues about neuroscience and the law. And I guess the first point that I would make is that an explanation is not thereby an excuse. And so it may help us understand something, and it may have some role in mitigation of sentence. But it isn't just by virtue of being an explanation. It isn't an excuse. I mean, the cases that most people are really interested in here come out of the finding in the Dunedin study that was done by Caspi and Moffat and their group. And basically, the finding was that there is a subset of males who have a variant in the gene for monoamine oxidase A. And that it's in males mostly because it's found on the X chromosome. And the finding was that for males who carry that variant and who are abused as children, they have a very high likelihood of sort of unprovoked aggression, hostility. They don't learn by being punished. They're in and out of the criminal justice system all their lives. Now, here's, of course, what you might think. You might say, well, they didn't ask to be born MAOA variants, and they didn't ask to be abused as children. So surely it's wrong to punish them for this really very violent behavior to which they are prone. The response, of course, is, look, the criminal justice system in the last analysis, and maybe this is something that pragmatists would agree with, but many jurists do, the criminal justice system has to do with civil safety. And if someone like an MAOA variant with an abusive upbringing is terribly violent, you can't just say, well, toodaloo, it's not your fault, off you go. And consequently, the way that this is handled, even when a defense lawyer argues that this isn't that, is that juries, I mean, the question of guilt can easily be determined. It always comes up in the question of sentencing. And juries, I think, mindful of the public safety issue, tend not to mitigate sentence. And does that mean that they think that this person is fully responsible? Probably, if you really back them into a corner, they wouldn't say that. On the other hand, they are very aware of their responsibilities as jurists, or as jury members rather, not to just let this person walk free. So it's a very, very difficult issue. And my own view is that the law really is interested in three things, the criminal law. Did he do it? Can he be treated? And will he do it again? And in the case of somebody like Loeffner in Arizona, the probability that he will do it again is extremely high because we do not know how to treat people like that. And ditto for MAOA variants with an abusive upbringing.
Yeah. So two or three more questions, and then I think we have to close down. But you had one, sir?
Dr. Churchland, you said that oxytocin split back in our history and our development. Do you know when that happened? Do they have any idea when that happened?
I really don't. I know that there are many very homologs of mammalian oxytocin and vasopressin. In birds, for example, there's mesotocin, which is just a little bit different. And as you may know, something like 90% of bird species tend to bond, have long-term bonding, whereas it's only about 5% of mammalian species that do. And you will see also that there is alloparenting in lots of bird species, as well as, of course, males helping to take care. So the work has been begun by a number of people, Jim Goodson at Indiana in particular, on studying the neurobiology of sociality in birds. And quite a lot of behavioral work, of course, has been done. I mean, absolutely brilliant work showing that birds have a sort of rudimentary theory of mind, or at least the corvids do, like scrub jays and ravens and so forth, because they know what their caching behavior should be as a function of what that guy can see and where he is in rank relative to me. It's quite subtle, actually. And and ravens, of course, are an order of magnitude more sophisticated and subtle in their social behavior. So I think that will eventually be sorted out. It's not known whether this is a matter of convergent evolution, which it may well be, or whether there was a common ancestor. And one of the reasons that's asked is because we do know that alligators, almost uniquely amongst reptiles, are responsive to the squeals of the babies and will go to them when there are separation distress calls.
So here's another one.
Question for Jesse. You mentioned multi-level science at some point, and I think the questions have been revolving around this. If we had different ways of asking questions, we would come up with different answers, and things like the law bring that into high relief, that certain questions can't be answered at a molecular level. So I'm just interested in knowing what you mean by multi-level science and what examples you could provide, both of you, for that.
Well, what I had in mind is really something very simple, which is whenever you have a behavior, there are different ways of identifying the cause of that behavior. And one dimension is just proximal and distal, what immediately led to that behavior on that occasion, and what played a role in setting up the disposition to behave that way in occasions like that. And when you ask the proximal question, psychological mechanisms, neural mechanisms may become an important part of the story. And once you've identified those, selection history, various factors that again would be told in the language of biology might be part of the story. But social science broadly, to include history, sociology, anthropology, those things are going to turn out to be, at least for the human case, part of the story too. So I think when we ask a question like what's the nature of human morality, we find these different research traditions giving all these answers that we haven't connected the dots between. So a psychologist might say a moral judgment is an emotional response. And a neurobiologist might say a moral judgment is something that hinges on maybe activation in the amygdala or the orbital frontal cortex, or if they're cellular and don't take fMRI that seriously, they'll say it's oxytocin or some neurotransmitter. It's a dopaminergic response. And then we have all these people doing the history of values from a cultural perspective. The very fact that we have, say, in this room, some people who vote Republican. That's probably untrue, but in this city, some people who vote Republican, and some people who I just did a political difference study, and at Brooklyn College with a graduate student there, he did all the work, Kendall Eskin, and he found some. Turns out there are some Republicans in Brooklyn, but they're all Orthodox Jews. You know, that's a fact for which the biology is going to be of limited interest. I think in the end, what the dot connecting is going to look like will vary from project to project, but one bit of it will be a story that goes from cultural context, or maybe an ecological context, something very large, to a method of moral transmission, a story about social learning. Is it imitative? Does it involve emotional conditioning? Does it involve love withdrawal? To an actual series of events going on inside of the organism, where there might be changes even in gene expression. You know, you could go down to the lowest levels of biological description, maybe find something going on when a parent says to a child, you know, I'm not going to play with a little girl like you or a little boy like you. I don't like kids like you. You take a time out. What goes on in the brain when that happens? It's that change that ultimately leads to the disposition, which is then manifest in the subsequent behavior. So if we want to understand why people vote Republican in a complete way, we need to learn the history of conservative politics and figure out why something so local as libertarianism ever got tied into, say, anti-communism, which is a very state-scale enterprise, these crazy mongrel political theories that we buy into as if they're natural kinds. Social science can tell us something about that. Brain science can tell us about the internalization. So I think we need people like Tat and the psychologists and the philosophers and anthropologists maybe sharing more office space and figuring out how to connect.
So one final thing then, before I close, which we have to do in a moment. Thank you so much for being here. It was wonderful. You're a great audience. But I want to ask Pat one last question, which is, writing a book like that takes an enormous amount of time, an enormous amount of energy. So what did you hope to achieve by doing that book?
Oh dear.
This?
I'm sure I'll say the wrong thing. Look, I guess the thing of it was that one has always wondered how values can be grounded and what the connection could possibly be between social behavior, evolutionary biology, molecular biology, and the brain. And I think I think the piece for me was the story of the voles. Because I had known a little bit about mammalian brain evolution before that, but once the story of the voles fell into place, and that was about 10 years ago, I guess, then the backfill was really provided by Barry Cavern and Jaak Panksepp and so forth. And then the forward part was provided by other people who work on culture, like Paul Seabright and David Hume.
So it's an extension, it's really a continuation of neurophilosophy, in a sense, right?
Yeah, I think
you want to
so.
inject?
Yeah, yeah.
All right, well, thank you for being here, and a round of applause for Pat Churchland and Jesse Prince.
Pleasures of writing science for a general public. And I'm happy to say this is now 3 years going on, and there's been no lack of enthusiasm or dedication. I think, as you can see by tonight's crowd and the way this has been put together, this brilliant, I think, program where we have a group of remarkable scholars who cut across the fields of philosophy, neuroscience, and scientific writing, and will present, I believe, a very engaging evening for us. Let me just make some thanks very quickly for the support of this, because there's some important people to be recognized, and then we'll go on with it. Of course, most of that support is money, because that's important. The Dana Foundation, the major support for this event actually comes from the Dana Foundation for Brain Research and Education. This was a large grant that they gave us, put together by Megan Fay and our Office of Development. Thank you very much, Megan, for putting us onto that. The Society for Neuroscience has generously donated some money as well. And from here at Columbia, the Office of the Executive Vice President for Research has donated money. The Department of Biology, how'd that happen? I don't know. Also the Department of Neuroscience, and I'd also especially like to thank Fred Loeff from the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, who has supported NeuWrite throughout and who provides the funding for the pizzas that fuel our discussions on a bi-weekly basis. So thanks to Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. Let me now turn the program over to Roger Bingham, our panelist and moderator, who will introduce everybody else and get us started. Roger.
Thank you all. Okay, so would you all please smile? No, I'm serious. Thank you. This is a wonderful gathering, and it's wonderful to have a rat. Science can tell you what right from wrong is. Show of hands, how many of you think that science can tell us right from wrong? You want to think about it? Some hands? So in general, you basically don't think this room, at this point, with the exception of 4 hands, do not think that science can tell us right from wrong. Is that correct? Okay. Your job now is to convince them differently. Pat Churchland.
Thanks, Roger. So thank you so much for being here. It's really a great honor and a great pleasure for me to be at Columbia, and it's wonderful for me to have the opportunity to tell you a little bit about the book. What I think I'm supposed to do is to talk very briefly, that is only for about a half an hour, about the main ideas, and then in the course of the conversation between the three of us, and I presume there will be questions as well, I think we can kind of amplify and develop some of the basic themes. So the question that really motivates me is where values come from. And we know, for example, that Darwin, and before him Hume, and before Hume Aristotle, said that it is in our nature to be social. And that if it is in our...
...record of it, although obviously we've got the videos and so on and so forth. But this is an amazing event. So much thanks to NeuWrite for doing this and so on and so forth. Pat Churchland is an old friend of mine and has been inventing this field, essentially. Is this working?
Is it?
This is working?
Okay.
Yeah, okay. In the preface to a book that she did some years ago, 1986, called Neurophilosophy, she said, in the mid-70s, I discovered that my patience with most mainstream philosophy had run out. Later on, she said, it's the nature of the case that boundaries are ill-defined. The book is thus a result of what I... You can't hear me?
Project.
So this is not working?
Sorry.
It is working, but I'm not.
Yeah.
So let's keep the microphone here and I will leave. Would that work? Pat has been an absolute trailblazer in this whole field of neurophilosophy. And although you can go to the current issue of the Philosopher's Magazine and look at experimental philosophy and so on, and is it time to burn the armchair? Pat burnt the armchair 25 years ago and has been doing amazing work since. Braintrust is her latest book. It's extraordinary. I really encourage you to read it. And there's a review in the Boston Globe today, what neuroscience can and can't tell us about moral life, which is extraordinary.
Good evening. Good evening. I'm Stuart Firestein. I'm the chairman of the biology department here at Columbia. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to Braintrust, a public conversation about morality and the brain. This is an event that was sponsored and put together by a group called, by the code name NeuWrite, which may be a mystery to some of you. To many of you, this is a group of students, writers of various sorts, scientists, who are particularly interested in the dissemination of science to the general public. NeuWrite as a group actually began at a retreat of the neuroscience department here at Columbia several years ago, when it turned out there were a group of students, a group of graduate students who were particularly interested in this issue of the public dissemination of science. I shared this concern with them. They knew some writing students from the Masters of Fine Arts, the MFA nonfiction writing program here in the School of the Arts, and we decided that we would begin meeting informally to discuss these very issues, how to make science accessible to the public, why this is so important not only to the culture but to the practice of science. I'm happy to say we began these meetings in my apartment, actually, here in the neighborhood, not far off campus. It was a nice informal venue, but we're a very disciplined group as well. And over the years, we met weekly. Now we meet mostly bi-weekly. We write. We workshop these writings. We talk about other writings. We have had many of the foremost science writers and journalists come visit us and talk to us about writing science. And so it's been a real serious exploration of the practice and the problems and the difficulties and the...
It's a tremendous review of the book, and I'm looking forward enormously to hearing what she has to say about it. And I also want to tell you a couple of things. If you're here, it's being filmed. John Booth is up there, Frank is up there. We're filming this thing. So do be aware that you're on camera, and if you're on the lam from the IRS, or you're here with somebody you shouldn't be with, this will be a good time to leave. All right? After Pat talks, there will be a tape change, just in the business of things, because we have to get a 1-hour tape going. So after Pat talks, there'll be a tape change. Jesse Prince will come up, and then we'll do the 3-panel. How many of you know about the Science Network? Okay. So if you go to www.thesciencenetwork.org, you will find there's a huge amount of material there on morality. We did some meetings some years ago called Beyond Belief 1, 2, 3. And then we went to Arizona recently and did a great debate on can science tell us right from wrong. So we had Sam Harris, Pat Churchland, Peter Singer, Samuel Blackburn, Steven Pinker, and Lawrence Krauss. At the earlier meetings, there was also Richard Dawkins there, various other people. And I think that this whole issue of morality has come back again, so we're going to do Beyond Belief 4 at some point, probably in the beginning of next year. Let me ask you a question that I asked at the beginning of the great debate, Can Science Tell Us Right from Wrong? That's essentially what the topic of Pat's book is, what neuroscience tells us about morality. How many of you at this point think that